this is like a hard transition to go from being joyful to talking about numbers. I promise it's going to be good. Thanks for mentioning I started at IBM. Another thing I wanted to mention was that I was actually a tester for a little while too, so I'm totally with you on this, right? Especially the part about being joyful and wanting to automate a bunch of things and also like swearing at your machine a whole bunch. Like who here has like sworn and like having the swears actually make it work? I swear, I am totally with you on that. So, but what I want to talk about a little bit here is how sometimes when we start talking about numbers and we start collecting things, it's really interesting because sometimes it actually changes our work environment and how we work. Has anyone here seen that at all? Right? Once a number like magically appears on a report, it changes the way everyone does something. Right? So it's somehow apparently, Simon, you and I like called each other up and like decided what we were going to talk about because our talks are kind of going to go together a little bit. So what I'm going to talk about is how metrics and our numbers kind of end up changing our culture, right? And it makes have we all heard about the DevOps, right? We want to like rub our DevOps on everything. So, right? This is real. Testers, we're a core fundamental part of this, right? Everyone talks about pulling the dev and the ops together. Testers are right in the middle of this, okay? So I want to start by talking about, like, giving a story. And one of my favorite stories here is the Amazon shopping cart. I'm assuming we've all heard about this because I prime everything. My story here is about Greg Linden. So Greg was a developer at Amazon, and he had this amazing idea because when we all go to the store, right, the grocery store, the convenience store, put everything in our cart and we walk up, and as we're waiting in line, we have like all of these wonderful things to tempt us. We have magazines and we have chocolates, and I always end up throwing something else in the cart, right? I'm always tempted by something. And so he thought, well, we have all of this data. I could give Nicole like a customized recommendation, right? Their recommendation engine. So Greg codes up a prototype and he walks into his SVP's office. He's like, look at this dope thing I just made. And his SVP's like, cool idea. Also, no. He's like, what do you mean no? Well, the idea is that in a grocery store, like, I'm physically trapped. Like, likelihood is low that I'm going to get distracted and drop everything and walk away. But as testers, we know that users are stupid. And we get distracted easily, and we're going to, like, walk away. And so his SVP, senior vice president, says no. So Greg, I imagine Greg looking like this, gets all sad, goes back to his office. Typey, typey, pushes into production. Love you, Greg. This is great. Leaves it in production for a little while and comes back with data. Loving cold hard data. And it results in a few percentage points of revenue. And at Amazon scale, this is millions of dollars. And so he goes back to that SVP and he's like, I'm guessing he was nicer than like, sorry, sucker. But this is then what Greg says. I think building this culture is the key to innovation. Creativity must flow from everywhere. Whether you're the summer intern or the CTO, any good idea must be able to seek an objective test, preferably a test that exposes the idea to real customers. Everyone must be able to experiment, learn, and iterate. Position, obedience, and tradition should hold no power. For innovation to flourish, measurement must rule. And I love this story because it's about having ideas, testing them out, collecting some data, and then seeing what happened. Greg didn't get fired. I don't know how happy the SVP was, but it worked. And so I'll be walking through a few things today that maybe sound like cliches, but it's backed by some really good data and metrics and what we can do to really understand what happens. So one is we can improve what we don't measure, right? Or we sort of can, but we won't actually know what led to those improvements unless they're really, really epic, right? And I'm sure we've seen this. I know as a tester, I definitely knew this, right? It was really hard to understand what was contributing to our wins, particularly when they were small, but those are the wins that we want to know about. Small incremental improvements are the ones that make the most difference, right? We often think everything is improving for us. By the way, humans are particularly bad at this, right? We think everything that we're contributing, all of our ideas are amazing, especially people in suits, right? Everyone in a suit, their ideas are always amazing, right? Their ideas are the best. So Ronnie Kahavi worked for years. What we've known, like a good heuristic is about 50% of our ideas are like good and 50% kind of suck. So Ronnie Kahavi finally went to Microsoft, told Microsoft this. Microsoft said, oh, no. We know our customers. We have a very, very well-developed customer base. We know what they buy. We know our product. We know what we're doing. We know what we're building. Does anyone here have a friend who works in a company like this? Their executives know exactly what they're building, right? Ronnie Kahavi finally convinced Microsoft to build out an experimentation platform. What they found is that the very best designed features and products, only about 1/3 actually delivered on the key metric. By the way, 1/3 didn't deliver anything, and then 1/3 took away from that. I don't know about y'all, but like for those other 2/3, like I want to be hanging out somewhere else, having umbrella drinks on the beach. And as we know, all of that extra code, all of that extra effort just contributes to an extra code base, right? That's technical debt that we have to maintain. That's extra stuff we have to test. So here's another one. Always measure things that matter. Most of us here are probably working in organizations for whom profit matters, right? So the goal is usually something that has to do with money, or end customers, or end users, right? Measure the things that matter. I've worked with some customers and some users that say, well, we want to improve continuous delivery. Like, that's cool, why? Because continuous delivery. Why? Don't do the DevOps because DevOps. Some board member like read a word and they think that's cool. No. We want to improve things because it helps what end goal? Helps us deliver value to our users, helps us deliver value to our customers. Let's think about what our end goal really is. So related to this, I'm sure we all know this. That which is measured gets managed. This is so real in business, right? You are what you measure, or at least you are whatever shows up on some random report. This is super real. If you capture only one metric, we know exactly what gets gamed. So, related to this, not everything that can be counted counts. So we used to do this thing where we would collect all of the data that was possible, and we would report on all of that data as well. So sometimes we want to take a step back. And by the way, this is where we have so much power and so much influence, right? Because as testers, especially when we're thinking about regressions and when we're thinking about what we want to report on, what do these numbers represent, right? What do they proxy? What do they stand for? How meaningful are they? What does it tell me? How can I use it to make a decision? How does it relate to an outcome, right? We just talked about the goal a minute ago. Does it still make sense to measure and track a metric? We can capture it for a while. Once I know I've really automated it and made it amazing for my function, maybe I can pull it off a report. Once I'm done, although I may need to pull it back and re-report on it once I've rolled new functionality. What are the unintended consequences of implementing something? This ends up becoming particularly true for metrics and measures that are really, really easy to automate. Becomes so real when we start reporting things to higher levels of management, higher levels of abstraction. Dr. Goldratt was the author of The Goal, that book I talked about earlier. He said, "Tell me how you measure me, and I will tell you how I behave." So actually, if I skip back quickly to the goal, maybe if it'll let me. Has anyone here read this book? Has anyone heard of this book? This book is dope. Okay, so has anyone here heard of the Phoenix Project? Okay, so the Phoenix Project is modeled after the goal. The goal is about someone who takes over for a manufacturing plant that's about to be shut down. And he keeps trying to figure out what's important, right? And he's thinking, well, I need to reduce inventories. No, well, I need to speed up manufacturing. No, well, I need to implement robots. And they realize, no, what's actually important is that I need to make money, right? I need to make money for the plant. And by continuing to focus on local goals, it might not help them make money for the plant. And so that's what helps them succeed as a business. So again, tell me how you measure me, and I'll tell you how I behave. Okay. Now, metrics inform our incentives and shape our behavior. Sometimes people get a little twitchy around this one, right? We don't always like to think about metrics informing our incentives, but incentives can be a lot of things, right? It can be bonuses, but it can just be like a gold star on our forehead. It can be a thumbs up at a meeting. It can be a comp day. It can be a lot of different things. But if we think about traditional software development delivery, right? Traditional dev practices, we think about getting into a traditional crunch, right? So let's think about what this might look like. If we think about what our metric is, delivering code on schedule. I'm sure we've seen this, right? This is pretty traditional. We've all seen this. We need to deliver our code on schedule. Our behavior, we sprint to deliver this by 5 p.m. on Friday. I'm sure I've been there. Our unintended consequence, our ops team spends the weekend putting out fires. Or I don't know about you. For me, I was sometimes the ops team, but for me as a tester, it was usually like me working with the ops team when we were making sure we got our regressions done on time. And it wasn't even the weekend. It was like I think we had 3 months of, we called it the death march. Has anyone, who has a friend that's done a death march? And they were like, you're lucky, we're bringing in lunch. And I'm like, lucky, this is Saturday and Sunday. I mean, I'm sure, no, not my company though. My friend, only my friend, right? And that's unfortunately what happens when we set these types of metrics, right? And we don't really think about it. Another one that I think is super important is just because something's hard to measure doesn't mean it's not worth measuring. And this happens so often, right? Particularly in organizations that just want to capture something quickly or easily. And one of the most common examples I see here is culture, right? Who here has heard that culture is important? Right? So many hands. Okay. So I work on the State of DevOps report. Has anyone here heard of that? So we measure software development and delivery and what types of things are really important to help drive that across organizations. We have over 23,000 data points around the world going back the last 4 years. And we know that there are several practices that help drive that across technical practices, including testing. Testing is a huge component. We also know that culture is a really, really large component. But so many times we talk to organizations and we work with organizations and they're like, oh, that's hard to measure, so we just skip it. And I'm like, you just skip it? Okay, sweet. And they're like, well, here's why. Okay, so I've worked in tests for a long time. I worked with hardware for a long time. I now also work with surveys. And so this is where I'm going to turn around. Who here thinks that surveys are... A few hands, because y'all are polite. So nice to me. Okay, who here loves data in all your log files and all your data? Your system files? Okay, lots of hands. Who here has seen awful data in your system files? Yeah, lots of hands. So it's really interesting because so many times I talk to customers and companies and they'll be like, oh, I'm never going to send out a survey because everyone lies in surveys. And then I'll be like, oh, so let's take a look at your system data and your log data. And they're like, oh, sure, but like I know all of it's bad. And I'm like, what? But it's interesting because we're so used to working with systems that we find ways to get around it, or we find ways to clean the data and scrub the data. But because so many of us aren't used to writing surveys or cleaning up survey data, we'll just skip it entirely, or we'll skip it completely, right? Or we'll say, well, we'll get that data out of HR systems. HR systems aren't great either, though, because HR systems tell us something different, right? Like, what happens if we want to use turnover data? Turnover data, first of all, that's too late. If we have someone really amazing on our team, I don't want to find out my culture's bad after they've already left. Second of all, like, I have an amazing team. I love my team. But if anyone here wants to offer me like $3 million, call me. Like, I'm out. I love my team, but if y'all paying me that much, I don't care how good my culture is, I'm joining your team, right? I know people who have left teams because the money was amazing, or I know people who have left their teams because the culture was so good, they encouraged them to go basically on a walkabout and figure out what they wanted to do, and they wanted to do something totally different and totally amazing. It was the good culture that encouraged them to leave. We can only measure culture through surveys, certain aspects of culture. So how do we do that then? There are ways we can do this through surveys, and they're called psychometric surveys because, like, I can't collect like a number for a survey. Like, I could find out what the temperature of the room is, right? That gives me a number. But if I want to collect like an organizational culture temperature and get one number, we do this through, like I said, something called psychometrics. And there are really good validated survey measures out there. Gives us a reasonable assurance that our survey's out there. Although, I do encourage everyone to still be a skeptic, right? Has anyone here seen or heard of spuriouscorrelations.com? This is amazing. Do you know that pool deaths in the United States are highly correlated with the year that Nicolas Cage movies come out? And cheese consumption is highly correlated with death by strangulation by bed sheets. One does not cause the other, by the way. Or if it does, we should chat, because that's... That's crazy. So here's what we often talk about when we talk about culture. We usually talk about things like breaking down silos, right? Having good communication, having blameless postmortems. Have we heard about these things? This is all sounding similar. I'm seeing some smiles and some nods. So when we work on the State of DevOps report, and when I do research, so my PhD is in MIS, which is like business and tech, we were looking for a type of organizational culture that talked about those things that I just mentioned. So what we did is we reached back to some of the research done by a sociologist named Dr. Ron Westrom. And he studied cultures that were particularly good at measuring culture in high-risk, complex organizations like healthcare and aviation and nuclear power that predicted performance outcomes and safety outcomes, and also helped predict what happens when things go wrong. High risk, complex, sounds like technology. So this is the typology that he describes. The first one is pathological. He calls it pathological. It's power-oriented, very command and control. So it's typified by things like low cooperation. The messenger is shot, right? If someone brings you bad news, you blame that person. Responsibilities are shirked. We don't bridge across teams. Failure leads to scapegoating. Novelty is crushed. Who here has a friend that might work in this type of organization? Knows some people? We have no friends that work here. Okay. The next one is bureaucratic. This is a rule-oriented organization. Modest cooperation. Messengers are neglected. If you bring me bad news, I just ignore you. I don't want to hear it, right? La, la, la. Narrowly defined responsibilities. Bridging is tolerated. Failure leads to justice, and novelty leads to problems. Now, I will point out that bureaucracy is not necessarily a bad thing. It was created to make sure, with the intention of making sure that everyone was treated incredibly fairly, right? Like everyone has the same set of criteria. It sometimes has unintended consequences, right? So who here maybe has a friend that works in a bureaucratic organization? Okay, a few hands. A generative or performance-oriented culture is typified by very high cooperation. Messengers are trained, and by messengers are trained, we want people to bring us bad news. We want to uncover any types of things that are happening. Risks are shared among everyone. Bridging's encouraged. This is kind of breaking down those silos. Failure leads to inquiry, right? So this is really those blameless postmortems. I want to uncover and I want to understand anytime something goes wrong. Novelty is implemented. Who here has a friend or is lucky enough to work in this organization? Who has no friends? We have no friends. Okay. So it's interesting. So in previous literature, this was found to be highly predictive of performance outcomes. We have found this to be highly predictive of IT performance. So the ability to develop and deliver software with both speed and stability. My nerd moment was Dr. Westrom somehow found out, I publish in peer review still, he discovered that we were using this and he emailed me one day and he was like, "Dear Nicole, I see you're using my work. Can I see it?" And I was like, "Oh, yes." And I emailed it off, and 10 minutes later I had this moment of panic of like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have responded. Luckily he emailed me back a couple weeks later and said like I was doing it right. Yay. So if you want to measure organizational culture yourself in a statistically valid and reliable way, you can ask these questions. Measure on a scale from strongly agree, 7, to strongly disagree, 1, where 4 would be neutral, right? Neither agree nor disagree. On my team, information is actively sought. On my team, failures are learning opportunities. On my team, responsibilities are shared. On my team, cross-functional collaboration is encouraged and rewarded. On my team, failure causes inquiry. And on my team, new ideas are welcomed. I know of several teams around the industry that are using this as like a quarterly check-in, right? A quick pulse check. It takes just a few minutes to answer. And what you can do is then average those scores together and then average them together for a team, which stats nerds in the room, I know you're going to tell, and on the stream, I know you're going to tell me don't average and average, but we can talk. When you pull them together, it creates a construct, so it's not really an average of an average. And then what ends up happening is you come together and you've created basically like your organizational culture temperature, right? Like you've come up with one number for your organizational culture score. So now you can measure some things that are hard to measure. That's one example of how you can do something like organizational culture. That's what we call a latent construct. You can follow the same approach for several other types of things. Think about what it is you want to measure, something like organizational culture. Think about what goes into it. So in org culture, we talked about the different types of things. We thought how we would measure it, come up with items, capture them, and then do all the stats magic. Call me if you want help. And then you can measure it and you can capture it. Now, what kinds of metrics do we want to collect? We want to collect data about systems and processes from the systems themselves? Absolutely. We want to collect data about systems and processes from people. And we want to collect data about culture and people from people. Now, here's why. We want to collect all of this data from systems because it gives us one great view into the system, right? Also, it's fast, it's reliable in most cases, right? It gives us high volume. We can capture it all the time, right? It can be highly instrumented. We can run wonderful analytics. We can get great analytics dashboards off of it. We can do fantastic, wonderful things off of this data. Who here is working on some instrumentation? And who here is planning on going to check out the new analytics dashboard? I took a look at it earlier. It's fantastic. So another thing we should do, though, is also consider asking people about what's happening with the systems, because the overall high-level view might look like this, but as testers in particular, we might know that the ground-level view might feel a little bit like this. So another way to think about it, right, is that when we have data from both people and systems, right, our pipeline might look like this, right? If we think about it as like a train system. Another view might look like this, okay? If we get a little bit more instrumentation in our system, I mean, it's automated. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. But it's super important to talk to the people that are working on the system, right? I know as a tester, there were so many times I would be working on a system and people would talk to me, or they would only look at like our test system or our outputs, and they would be like, you know, everything's fine, right? Everything looks like it's running fine. Everything's lovely. I don't know what you're talking about. Everything runs through the system. All of our tests are being executed on time. But they would never actually ask us and realize that we really had to have a handful of people on call at exactly the right time, or there was no way this stuff was shipping. Like, there was no way it was shipping. And if you don't have the right people there and the right teams there, and if we don't have the metrics from all different angles, then we might not have full visibility into our systems. So, what can we all do to really help shape our culture and shape the metrics? Because I know metrics and data have kind of become a bigger term right now, but not all companies are on board. So one thing we can do is read and share Data Driven. It's a short book by O'Reilly. It's a free download. It's about 20 pages. It's written by DJ Patel and Hillary Mason. DJ Patel was the chief data scientist in the White House in the last administration. Hillary Mason has done several things. She was chief data scientist at Bitly and a few other places. This has been a great resource for me when I've been in organizations or when I've talked to other organizations, because it's easy to circulate. People can kind of scan through it, and it talks about what different data roles might be, different ways to use data in organizations, different things you can do with it. You can also ask people in your organization what they're doing with metrics. Is metrics happening anywhere? Like, is it a thing? Is it important? Are they being used? What types of reports are they using it on? And it's really interesting to think about different ways it's being used. You know, I mentioned earlier that just having numbers appear on reports can drastically change behavior. One of my favorite stories and craziest stories was an example where I was talking to a company and they had unlimited PTO, right? Unlimited vacation. But the number of vacation days showed up on managers' reports. Or not number of times someone had taken vacation, rather. And so if an employee was going to be out on a Monday and on a Friday, that counted as 2 absences. So they would ask them to just be out the whole week, because out the whole week counted as 1 time being gone instead of 2 times being gone. But they had unlimited PTO. And so they just took that off of reports, and suddenly they stopped caring. Right? So we can just start having conversations and asking, because like they were noticing that there was this really weird behavior and they didn't understand why this behavior was happening. It was happening because it was just appearing on reports, right? This affects behavior. You can think about your own metrics. Always start with outcomes, right? Measure what matters. So, what matters to you? What's important? And then think about what influences those outcomes. And I think the biggest thing that's important to us is to define and communicate them. Because we always end up in this crazy, interesting thing where like developers and testers and operations and business sometimes use the same word, but it has a different definition. And I'm seeing smiles and nods, so I'm not the only one. Or, like, the reverse is true, right? Like, we'll have kind of a definition thing, but like use different words for it. So it can really help to try to come up with like a glossary or something within our organization. Sometimes that alone can go a long way. And that is almost not even metrics, but it ends up being huge in terms of breaking down barriers and setting a cultural kind of standard. Because metrics help us communicate. So a key here, right, give them meaningful names. Define them well, and try to communicate them often and across boundaries. Because the metrics themselves end up being huge communication tools, which so often people just don't realize. So sometimes just setting that, just defining your metrics, deciding what's important, can be a huge first step. And the interesting thing can be that it helps signal to other teams what's important to you. So here's what we've kind of talked about so far. You can't improve what you don't measure, or if you do, you'll have no idea, right? Otherwise, we will only know if it's an epic win or an epic fail, and those are scary. Always measure the things that matter. That which is measured gets managed. If you capture only one metric, you'll know exactly what gets gamed. So try to measure 2 or 3 things. Metrics inform our incentives, and they shape our behavior. Not everything that can be counted counts. Just because something is hard to measure doesn't mean that it is not worth measuring. Not all data is created equal, and we should collect measures from both systems and people. And then I just wrapped up with measures and metrics are amazing communication tools. Now, if you want any more metrics goodness, you can grab your phone and send an email to nicolefv@sendyourslides.com. I've got a 93-page excerpt to accelerate. I'll send you a copy of this presentation. I have an ROI white paper. I have a metrics guidance white paper. And I have an ACMQ article on why survey data and system data should go together and why they're really, really great complements. And that was actually co-authored by Mick Kirsten. Again, that's NicoleFV@sendyourslides.com. And that is my time today. So thank you so much, everyone.